She only wanted to escape for one night. Escape from the father who never listened to her, from the village that silently judged her. But when Claire was found unconscious in the snow, in the arms of a man who lived isolated from the world, what began as survival became a sentence. Forced to marry him to restore her honor, no one could have imagined what would truly unfold within that cabin, least of all, her. If this story touches you, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments where you're listening from. Your support helps us continue bringing stories that warm, even in the coldest of winters. The wind howled through the trees like a wounded animal, furious and relentless. Snow fell in thick, blinding sheets, covering any trace of a path or direction. The village of Holleridge had warned its residents to stay indoors, but Claire Montgomery had not listened. Not because she was reckless, but because silence was the only thing louder than the cold in her father's home. Wrapped in a wool coat 2 sizes too big, Claire pushed forward against the blizzard, her cheeks stinging from the icy air. Her boots sank deeper into the snow with each step, and her breaths turned into sharp, visible clouds. She had fled the general store after another argument with her father, Frank Montgomery, who believed women were meant to serve, not speak. Claire had dared to ask about the ledgers, about inconsistencies she had noticed. That was enough to unleash the storm inside him, harsher than the one outside. Now, lost and shivering, Claire realized she'd made a mistake. The forest looked the same in every direction. Her legs ached, her vision blurred. She turned in a slow circle, calling out, "Hello?" Her voice disappeared into the white. There was no answer, only the moan of wind in the pines. Then came the crack. The snow beneath her gave way. Claire's body plunged into a ravine hidden beneath the drifts. A sharp scream escaped her lips before it was swallowed by the storm. She landed hard, her ankle twisting beneath her. Pain shot through her body like fire. She couldn't move, couldn't climb out. The cold was creeping in faster now, through her coat, through her skin, into her bones. Tears stung her eyes as she huddled into herself, whispering prayers she didn't believe in. Please. Someone... Far above, through the flurry, a dark silhouette paused near the edge of the ravine. The man was tall, dressed in thick furs, his beard flecked with snow. He knelt, squinting into the pit. When he saw the shape at the bottom, unmoving but alive, he didn't hesitate. Matthew Albright hadn't spoken to another soul in weeks. His cabin was high in the mountains, far from the judgmental eyes of Holleridge. He preferred it that way. Isolation was easier than pity, easier than memories. But as he descended the slope carefully, his heartbeat quickened. "Don't move," he called, his voice steady despite the wind. "I'm coming." Claire looked up, startled. Her lips trembled, but no words came. He reached her minutes later and crouched beside her, assessing the damage. Her face was pale, lips bluish, ankles swelling rapidly. "We need to get you warm," he muttered more to himself than to her. Without waiting for permission, he slid his arms beneath her and lifted her effortlessly. Claire gasped, not from pain, but from the unfamiliar feeling of being held. Matthew carried her through the storm like she weighed nothing. The climb was brutal, and the snow tried to steal his footing more than once, but he didn't falter. Claire's head rested against his chest, her breath shallow, eyes fluttering. She caught glimpses of his features, a stern jaw, dark eyes that didn't avoid hers, and a quiet strength she hadn't known existed in Holleridge. When they finally reached his cabin, the world seemed to shift. Inside it was dim but warm, lit by a crackling fire. The scent of pine wood and something faintly metallic filled the air. Matthew laid her gently on a worn couch near the hearth and pulled off his gloves, kneeling beside her. "Let me see the ankle." Claire nodded faintly. She was too weak to argue, too cold to care. His fingers were rough but careful. He unwrapped her boot slowly and winced as he saw the swelling. "It's not broken," he murmured, "but you won't be walking for a while." He wrapped her foot with a strip of cloth, his hands steady. Then he draped a thick quilt over her body and stood to tend the fire. Claire watched in silence. Her heart raced for reasons she didn't understand. The cabin was simple, no decorations, no distractions, just fire, wood, tools, and him. She wasn't sure what she had expected. A drunk, a brute. That's what the villagers said he was. A man haunted by ghosts, unfit for polite company. But this man who had carried her through the snow without a word wasn't that. Hours passed. Matthew brewed a cup of tea and handed it to her without a word. Their eyes met briefly, hers searching, his unreadable. Then he stepped back into the shadows of the room, giving her space without being asked. That night, Claire lay beneath the quilt, listening to the crackle of firewood. Matthew had retreated to the far corner, sitting in a chair with a book he didn't seem to read. The storm raged on outside, but inside there was only silence. And in that silence, something shifted. It wasn't comfort, not yet, but it also wasn't fear. When morning came, the snow had blanketed the world in stillness. Claire's ankle throbbed, but her heart was steady. She opened her eyes and saw Matthew by the window, gazing out with a distant look, one hand resting on the frame. He didn't turn when he spoke. "You should rest, it's not safe to leave yet." "I know," she whispered. Her voice was hoarse. "Thank you for saving me." He looked over his shoulder, nodded once, and turned back to the snow. No apology for the silence, no explanation for the solitude. But maybe, just maybe, that was the language he spoke. And maybe, she thought, that would be enough. For now. By the time the blizzard finally eased and the path to Hollow Ridge cleared, 2 days had passed. 2 days in which Claire remained in Matthew's cabin, not by choice but by necessity. Her ankle still throbbed, though the swelling had begun to ease. The fire had never gone out, and yet, between the warm walls of the cabin, the silence lingered like unspoken fog. Matthew didn't pry. He barely spoke at all. He brought food, water, and a second blanket, and when she needed help walking to the chair near the fire, he offered his arm. Brief, steady, respectful. Not once did his gaze linger too long or carry weight, and not once did Claire feel unsafe, only unsure. But outside those walls, Hollow Ridge burned with curiosity. It was a small, mountain-locked village where word traveled faster than any storm, and where silence was often filled in with imagination. The Montgomery girl, so gone for 2 days, then seen returning in a cart pulled by a man the town had long since buried in rumor. Her cheeks were flushed from fever, her hair tangled, her ankle bandaged, and behind her, walking with the same solemn pace, was Matthew Albright. Claire said nothing as the villagers stared, nor did Matthew, but their silence was not allowed to last. Later that evening, Frank Montgomery barged into the house with fists clenched and fury in his eyes. Claire was seated on the edge of her bed, trying to process everything, when he burst through the door and roared, "What did you do?" She flinched, then straightened. "I was lost. I fell. He saved me. You stayed with him for 2 nights. His voice cracked with rage and something else. Shame, perhaps. "The entire town is talking. You've disgraced this family." Claire's lips parted, but no sound came. She hadn't touched Matthew, hadn't even crossed the line of politeness. But none of it mattered. The truth had no weight when the village had already built a story without her. Frank turned to Matthew, who stood quietly by the door. "You think you can just take what doesn't belong to you? She's not yours." Matthew's jaw tightened, but he didn't retaliate. He glanced at Claire, then spoke low. "I didn't take anything. I only kept her safe." The word safe might as well have been invisible to Frank. "Then fix it," he spat. "You want to protect her reputation? Then you marry her," Claire gasped. "What? You think this village will ever see you the same?" her father snarled. "You think a man will still want you? People are already whispering. Margaret Remington saw you two at the well. That's all it takes here." Claire's hands trembled. "You're trading my life for their approval?" Frank didn't flinch. "You'll marry him tomorrow. I already spoke to the pastor." It happened so fast. Too fast. The next morning, a hollow ceremony was held in the tiny chapel on the hill. Only a handful of people attended, out of curiosity more than support. Claire wore a pale dress borrowed from the back of her closet. Her hair was pinned back by her mother in silence. No music, no celebration, only murmurs behind gloved hands and eyes that refused to look at her with compassion. Matthew stood beside her, solemn as ever. He hadn't spoken since the arrangement was forced, and when the pastor asked if he accepted the union, He said yes with the kind of voice that wasn't warm but not cold either. More like surrender. Claire, when her turn came, said yes too. Not because she wanted to, but because in Holleridge, choices came with consequences too heavy for a woman to carry alone. The moment the ceremony ended, Matthew offered his hand. Claire took it, unsure if it meant anything at all. They returned to the cabin together, this time not as strangers, but not yet as husband and wife either. Claire sat on the same couch where she had healed days ago. The fire crackled, the silence now heavier. Matthew placed her bag near the doorway and cleared his throat. "I'll sleep in the loft," he said. "You can take the bed." She turned to him, startled. "You don't have to—" "It's not about what I have to do," he interrupted softly. "It's what's right." Claire nodded. Her hands gripped the sides of her skirt. She wanted to say thank you, or maybe ask if he was angry, but the words caught in her throat. That night she lay in his bed staring at the wooden beams above. The quilt smelled faintly of cedar and fire. Through the thin wall, she could hear the creak of floorboards as Matthew settled in above. She didn't cry, not because she wasn't sad, but because the numbness had settled deeper than tears. The next day, no one came to visit. No congratulations, no cakes or flowers. The marriage was real, but not welcomed, at least not yet. Claire wandered the cabin during daylight hours, adjusting to the space now called home. It was rustic, with shelves full of tools, books with spines too worn to read, and walls decorated only by necessity. A hammer, a bow, coats, firewood stacked like bricks of survival. She found an old sewing box tucked into a drawer and began stitching small cloths just to fill the silence. Matthew chopped wood outside for hours, only returning inside when his hands were blistered. He cooked, she cleaned. He didn't raise his voice. She didn't ask questions. They orbited each other like moons tethered to separate planets. But one evening, Claire watched him through the window, sleeves rolled up, eyes narrowed with focus, swinging the axe again and again into the chopping block. There was no rage in his movement, only rhythm, precision, purpose. Something about the way he moved made her chest tighten. He wasn't cruel, he wasn't careless. He just didn't know what to do with her presence, and perhaps neither did she. As the days passed, Claire realized the town had already moved on. Whispers faded, new gossip took its place. But what remained was the quiet between her and Matthew. A quiet that now pulsed with something more than absence. It held questions, possibilities, fears, and perhaps, if she allowed it, something that might one day feel like hope. The wind no longer howled like it had during the storm, but inside the cabin silence still reigned. A silence not born of peace, but of distance. Claire woke each day to the creak of old wood and the scent of fire smoke embedded deep in the beams. The mornings were grey, the afternoons were quiet, and the nights were long. Matthew rose early, before the sun, leaving the warmth of the loft with the practiced stealth of a man used to solitude. Claire often heard his footsteps as he crossed to the hearth, lit the fire and left to gather wood or hunt. He rarely spoke unless necessary, a word here, a nod there. His presence was not threatening, but neither was it warm. He moved like a man haunted by discipline and memory, not desire or companionship. Claire tried to fill the space he didn't touch. She kept the floors swept, the few dishes clean, and the fire burning. She found a rhythm in the mundane, chopping vegetables with borrowed patience, organizing the shelf with herbs, even washing linens by hand in a basin by the window. But every task only reminded her of how little she belonged. The cabin wasn't large, but it held a weight she couldn't explain. There were no personal trinkets, no laughter trapped in the walls, only the strict geometry of survival. A coat hung with precision, knives aligned, boots always turned the same way. It wasn't a home, it was a structure of control, and she was a guest too polite to breathe too loudly. There were moments, though, that broke the stillness. One morning, she found a book left open on the table, a volume of poetry, surprisingly delicate. The page was marked with a folded leaf, dried and golden. She didn't dare ask if it was meant for her, but that night, she placed the book gently back where she had found it, careful not to disturb the page. Matthew said nothing. Yet the next day, a second book appeared beside it. They never spoke of it, but the pages became part of their quiet language. At night, she lay under his quilt, listening to the wind press against the windows. Sometimes she could hear him upstairs, a chair creaking, the floor shifting beneath his weight, a cough muffled into his arm. That simple knowledge that someone else breathed in the same space kept her from crumbling. But it also reminded her of the boundary between them. One evening, as the snow fell gently outside, Claire gathered the courage to ask the question that had weighed on her since the wedding. They sat at the small table, bowls of stew between them, steam rising in the dim light. "Why did you agree?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. Matthew paused, spoon halfway to his lips. He didn't look at her. "Would it have mattered if I hadn't?" She swallowed. "To me it would have." Silence again. But this one felt sharper, thinner, like it could cut skin. After a moment he set down the spoon. "You didn't deserve what they were saying." Claire looked down at her hands. "That's not the same as wanting to marry someone," Matthew's voice lowered. "It was the only way I could protect you and that they'd accept." She didn't know what hurt more, the honesty or the resignation behind it. And yet, there was no anger in his words, no bitterness, just truth, laid bare like everything else in that cabin. The days continued, each one blurring into the next. She found small things to hold on to, the way he always left her the corner piece of bread, which she preferred. The time he gently added a second log to the fire before going to bed, as if he knew she sometimes woke cold, the way he handed her tools silently when she mended the stitching on a curtain, watching from the shadows. These weren't grand gestures. They weren't declarations. But in a place where no one else saw her, these quiet acknowledgements became the faint outlines of something she didn't dare name. Then came the snowfall that trapped them for 3 days. The wind rose again, and the trail disappeared completely. For 72 hours they were cut off from the world. No contact, no outside voices, no escape. Claire felt the weight of the cabin even more deeply during that time. The air seemed thicker, the silence more pressing. They shared every meal, every space, yet neither spoke of the wedding, of what came next, of what this was. One night during the storm, Claire sat by the window, watching the snow pile higher than the windowsill. "You ever think about leaving this place?" she asked. Matthew was seated across the room sharpening a knife. He didn't pause. "Sometimes. Why don't you?" His hand slowed, then stilled. He looked at her for the first time that day. "Because I've already buried too much here." Claire didn't respond. What could she say to a man who had buried dreams while she had barely learned how to dream at all? When the storm finally passed and light spilled again into the cabin, it felt almost foreign. Claire stood at the doorway, breathing in the crisp air, and for a moment she imagined running, back to Holleridge, back to the life that at least had boundaries she understood. But something kept her still. Not duty, not obligation. Curiosity, perhaps. The kind that grows in the cracks of silence, in the gaps between footsteps on wooden floors. The kind that wonders what might exist behind a man's long-held walls, or within a cabin that had once felt like a prison, and was now becoming a question she didn't yet know how to answer. Spring had not yet arrived, but the days were growing longer. The snow around the cabin began to recede in patches, revealing dark earth and the first signs of thaw. The trees still stood bare, but the wind carried a different tone, less of warning, more of memory. It was in one of those quiet afternoons, when Matthew had gone hunting, that Claire found the letter. She hadn't meant to go looking. While cleaning the shelves near the hearth, she moved a box of old carving tools to dust behind it. A slip of yellowed parchment slid from beneath a stack of folded cloth. Her instinct told her to leave it untouched. But the handwriting on the envelope caught her breath. Not Matthew's. It was her name. Her full name, in a hand she hadn't seen in nearly 2 years. Claire Evangeline Montgomery. Her fingers hesitated. Then, slowly, she broke the seal. The ink had faded, but the words still lived. "Claire, I know you may never forgive me, and perhaps I don't deserve it, but not a day passes that I don't think about you, what we had and what I destroyed. I left because I was a coward, not of you, of myself. I believed I needed to become something more before I could be yours, and now I see I only became something less. I'm returning. If there's a corner of your heart that hasn't turned to ice, I'll wait there." Julian Clare sat down, the letter trembling in her hands. Julian Avery, the man who had once promised her everything, a future, a life far from Holleridge. He had held her hands beneath the willow tree by the river and whispered vows he never kept. And then, just before the engagement was to be announced, he vanished. No explanation, no goodbye, only silence. Until now. She folded the letter slowly, carefully, and placed it on the table. Her pulse beat hard beneath her skin. That old ache, the one she thought time had dulled, pulsed again in her chest. Later that evening, Matthew returned, his boots leaving traces of wet soil across the wooden floor. He carried 2 rabbits and laid them on the table, his hands red from the cold. Claire didn't mention the letter. She couldn't. Not yet. That night she sat alone by the fire, Julian's voice echoing in her mind. He was coming back, and with him, the part of her past she had never fully buried. When the knock came 3 days later, it was like a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. Matthew looked at her from across the room, his expression unreadable, then crossed to the door. He opened it with quiet caution. There, standing with a travel coat and polished boots dusted in snow, was Julian Avery. He looked sharper than before, more angular, well-dressed, confident in that rehearsed, effortless way. His eyes searched the room until they landed on her. "Claire," he breathed. She rose slowly, her hand trembling near her side. "Julian, I came to—" Matthew stepped aside, not blocking the door, but not leaving it either. His presence filled the space with quiet gravity. Julian's voice softened. "Could we talk? Alone?" Claire looked at Matthew, who met her gaze without resistance. He nodded once and turned toward the back room, leaving them standing in the silence of flickering firelight. Julian stepped closer. "You look different. So do you. I see you've built a life here." His tone tried to be neutral, but the edge was visible. She didn't answer. He looked at her more intently. "Claire, I made a mistake. A terrible one. But I'm here now. I've built something. A business. Her name. I can give you what you always deserved. We don't have to pretend anymore. You don't belong here." Her jaw tensed. "You mean I don't belong with him? You belong with someone who knows your worth." She took a long breath, her heart racing not with affection but with anger. "Do you think worth comes with a bank account?" Julian looked slightly taken aback. She stepped past him, slowly. "You didn't just leave me, Julian. You erased me. For months I was a ghost in my own home because of what you did. Do you know how that feels?" He opened his mouth, but she held up a hand. "You think I stayed here because I was forced?" Her voice shook now, but it wasn't weakness. It was clarity. "Maybe in the beginning. Maybe even now I'm still trying to understand what this all means. But I know one thing. Matthew never promised me anything. And yet, he never left." Julian's voice dropped. "You're choosing this life? A cabin in the woods with a man who barely speaks?" "I'm choosing the truth," she said, eyes shining, "even when it's quiet." He exhaled slowly. "You've changed." "I hope so." Julian looked at her one last time, then nodded, his expression unreadable. "If you ever change your mind—" She cut him off with a gentle but final shake of the head. He left without another word. Claire stood at the door for several minutes, staring into the dusk. Her hands were still trembling, but her heart felt strangely steady. Matthew emerged from the back room, slow and quiet. He didn't ask what had been said, didn't make a sound, but when she turned to look at him, his eyes met hers. There was no jealousy there, only something quieter, recognition. Later that night, Claire placed Julian's letter into the fireplace. She watched as the edges curled, blackened, and turned to ash. The past had spoken, and she had listened, but she would not let it define her anymore. Still, as she sat alone by the fire watching the flames dance, she felt something unsettled in her chest. Not regret, not sorrow, but something else. Like a door had closed, and another hadn't opened yet. And when Matthew walked past, his hand brushing the edge of the table where she sat, She felt a question rise between them, but neither of them was ready to ask it. The forest was still recovering from the thaw. Trees stood skeletal, their branches etched like veins against a steel-grey sky. The earth beneath the melting snow was damp and heavy, and the wind still whispered secrets through the pines. Claire had begun taking small walks during the late mornings, always staying close to the cabin. Her ankle had healed enough for steady steps, and she craved air, fresh and wide and unscripted. The silence inside had grown dense again after Julian's visit, and though Matthew had resumed his quiet ways, something between them had shifted. A tension neither of them dared to name. That morning, Claire bundled herself in her long coat, wrapped a scarf around her neck and stepped outside. The cold bit at her cheeks, but the light was soft, diffused through the branches like a gentle veil. She carried a small woven basket to gather twigs for kindling, and herbs beginning to peek through the thaw near the rocks. Each step into the woods felt like reclaiming something. Her pace was careful, her senses alert, but the solitude comforted her more than it unnerved her. She reached a clearing she liked, a patch where the sun touched the moss and the air smelled of wet bark and new beginnings. She crouched near a bush, brushing snow aside to reach the small green shoots when she heard it. A low growl. Claire froze. Slowly she looked up. 3 wolves stood at the edge of the trees, their fur thick and mottled with mud and frost. Their eyes were sharp, yellow, fixed on her. One took a slow step forward, its lips curled just slightly, enough to expose the threat beneath. Claire's basket fell from her hands. Her heart slammed in her chest as she stood, hands trembling, legs rooted to the ground. She didn't scream, didn't move, just stared, helpless, as the wolves crept closer. Another growl, louder now, closer. She took a step back and stumbled. Her foot hit a root and she fell hard onto the frozen ground. Her breath knocked from her lungs. Snow clung to her coat and pain jolted through her elbow. And then a gunshot tore through the air. The sound cracked like thunder. The wolves bolted, startled, fleeing into the trees with panicked yelps. Another shot rang out, not aimed at them, but above, a warning, a claim. When Claire looked up, Matthew was there. He was breathless, his rifle gripped tightly in his hands, eyes scanning the woods like a man ready to kill if needed. His boots crunched in the snow as he rushed toward her, face pale with something more than cold. "Claire!" he called. She sat up, chest heaving, unable to speak. He dropped to his knees beside her. "Did they touch you?" His voice was rough, ragged. She shook her head. "No. Her words broke, and without thinking, without permission, she leaned forward and clutched the front of his coat, burying her face in the wool, her fingers gripping the fabric like it could anchor her to the world again. Matthew froze. Then slowly, his arms wrapped around her. Firm. Steady. She didn't cry. Not really. But her body trembled against his, all the adrenaline unraveling in her bones. And for the first time since she had entered his cabin, Claire wasn't afraid of closeness. His embrace wasn't romantic. It wasn't grand, but it was real. Warm. Present. Matthew held her until the shaking eased, until her breathing slowed, until her fingers finally released his coat and her head lifted from his chest. Only then did he speak again. "Let's go home." She nodded. He helped her to her feet, his hand still holding her arms gently. Their eyes met, and something passed between them. Not a promise, not yet, but a recognition of something forming in the silence they had shared for so long. Back at the cabin, he made her tea without asking. She sat by the fire, still in her coat, watching the flames as if they might offer an answer. The basket had been left behind, but she didn't care. When he returned, he crouched in front of her and offered the cup. "Thank you," she whispered. He didn't respond with words. Instead, he reached behind him, pulled something from his coat pocket, and placed it on the table beside her. A small carving, freshly made. 2 figures in wood, rough but beautiful. A woman and a man sitting side by side, not touching, but close, so close. Claire stared at it. Her chest tightened. She looked up at him, but Matthew had already turned away, walking to the window, where the last rays of afternoon light painted the snow in shades of gold and grey. She sat in silence, the carving resting in her hand, its edges smooth from his touch. And for the first time, the cabin didn't feel like a prison. It felt like shelter, not from the storm outside, but from the storm she had carried within for so long. Yet as the fire crackled and the night crept in, she wondered, had he carved it before the wolves or after? Claire kept the carving on the small shelf near her bed, not hidden but not displayed like a trophy either. It rested between a candle stub and a folded handkerchief, as if it belonged there, as if it had always been there. She found herself glancing at it more often than she expected, sometimes in the morning light, sometimes before bed. Two figures carved from the same piece of wood, nearly touching but not quite. That space between them said more than any letter Julian had ever written. After the wolves, something shifted in the air between her and Matthew. Not dramatically, not like falling in love in a storybook, but in the small ways that matter. He no longer avoided her gaze. He started asking quiet questions. If she needed anything from the market, if the stew had too much salt, if her ankle still ached when it rained. She answered simply, but every exchange felt like a thread being pulled taut between them. One morning, Claire stood at the sink washing a pair of mugs when she noticed a splinter in her palm, a thin, sharp sliver embedded just beneath the skin. She hissed softly, dropping the mug. Matthew was across the room sharpening a tool, but looked up at once. What happened? Just a splinter, she said quickly, turning to hide it. But he was already walking toward her. Let me see. Claire hesitated. Then, without a word, extended her hand. He took it gently, his touch far softer than she had expected. His fingers were warm and calloused, firm yet cautious, as if he feared causing her more pain. It's deep, he muttered, squinting. You'll need it out. He retrieved a small blade from the table, sharp, clean, and pulled a stool closer. Sit. She obeyed, heart thudding louder than it should have. He knelt in front of her, one hand holding hers, the other maneuvering the blade with precision. The pain was brief but sharp. Claire flinched. His thumb brushed over her wrist, not to soothe exactly, but to anchor. It's out, he murmured after a moment. He dropped the tiny splinter into a tin dish and reached for a strip of cloth. Without needing to ask, he wrapped her palm carefully, knotting it at the base of her hand. Thank you, she whispered, eyes lingering on his face. He didn't reply, but he didn't pull away either. His hand remained resting lightly over hers, not possessive, not hesitant, just present. They stayed like that for a few seconds too long. Then, as if some invisible signal passed between them, he stood and stepped back. Later that evening, Claire was reading by the fire when she heard soft, measured knocks outside the door. She opened it to find Margaret Remington standing there, wrapped in furs, her mouth tight, eyes scanning every detail of the cabin behind Claire's shoulder. Good evening, Margaret said without warmth. Mrs. Remington, Claire nodded politely. Can I help you? I thought I'd come by to see if you were settling in. Her tone was more accusation than concern. Claire stepped outside to avoid giving the woman the satisfaction of peering inside. I'm well, thank you. Margaret sniffed. There's word that Julian Avery is back in town. Claire didn't flinch. I heard. Margaret's eyes narrowed. You know, Claire, it's never too late to correct a mistake. Claire raised her chin. What mistake? Margaret blinked. Surely you don't think this arrangement is permanent? Claire's voice was calm even. I think permanence is what you choose to build, not what others approve. Margaret pursed her lips. You were such a bright girl. It's a shame to see potential dimmed by isolation. Claire smiled then, not mockingly, but with something close to peace. Sometimes it's in isolation that things finally bloom. Margaret said nothing. She turned and walked away, boots crunching in the frost. Claire stood at the threshold a moment longer before stepping back inside. Matthew looked up from the far corner, where he was carving another piece of wood. Everything all right? He asked. She nodded. Just a shadow from the past. That night, as she prepared for bed, she found a second carving on the shelf, smaller than the first. It wasn't finished, but the outlines were there. Two figures again. This time, their hands touched. She ran her fingers over the wood, heart beating slow and deep. In the morning, she found herself moving through the cabin differently. She stirred the soup while humming softly. She adjusted the curtain to let in more light. She smiled when she passed Matthew by the fire, and he looked up and just briefly asked and smiled back. It wasn't joy. It wasn't romance. Not yet. But it was presence. It was choosing to stay. And it was enough to make her wonder what else might be possible if neither of them walked away. The thaw was giving way to mud now, dark, thick, and everywhere. The snow had all but melted, revealing the rawness of earth beneath. Branches hung heavy with water. The trails around the cabin turned slick. Even the air had changed, no longer biting cold but damp and hesitant. Like the woods themselves weren't sure what season they belonged to. Inside the cabin, the silence had changed too. Not the comfortable kind Claire and Matthew had grown into over the past few weeks, the one that held glances and small gestures like seeds in soil. This silence was sharp, edged, cold. It no longer wrapped around them. It pressed between them, keeping them apart. It began with a rumor. Claire had gone into the village alone to gather fabric and dried herbs. She hadn't been there in weeks, and most of the villagers only offered stiff nods or passive glances. But at the corner stall near the chapel, she heard two women whispering behind a basket of apples. I saw her speaking to Julian again, one said, near the baker's. Poor Matthew, the other replied, lips pursed. He always was strange, but to be made a fool. Claire froze. She hadn't spoken to Julian. Not since she'd closed the door on him, but the villagers, they never needed facts, only suggestion. And in a place like Holloridge, suggestion was enough to build a story. She returned to the cabin with her jaw clenched and eyes distant. Matthew was outside chopping wood when she arrived. He didn't look up, not when she greeted him, not when she passed him, not even when she lingered in the doorway, silently asking for a moment of connection. He didn't speak to her that evening, not over dinner, not by the fire. The next morning he left before dawn, and the silence between them deepened. Claire tried to ignore it, to push through. She baked bread, she swept the floors, she set the table with care. But every task felt futile, like trying to build a bridge across a river no longer there. 3 days passed. On the 4th, she found him in the shed behind the cabin, bent over a half-carved beam. "You're angry," she said, voice firm. Matthew didn't look up. "I'm working. I didn't ask what you were doing." Silence. Claire stepped inside, arms crossed over her chest. "You heard something, didn't you?" He turned the carving in his hand, inspecting the grain. "Does it matter?" "Yes," she snapped, louder than she intended. "It does, because I haven't spoken to Julian, not since he came here, not once." Matthew's hand stilled. She took a breath. "If you believed anything else, you could have asked me." Now he looked up. His eyes were tired, not furious, but wounded. "I didn't know if I had the right." Claire blinked. "The right?" "I was never supposed to be your husband," he said, standing now, taller than her, more present than he'd been in days. "I was a name chosen to clean up a scandal, to make you acceptable again. That's what they wanted. That's what your father wanted." She stepped closer, her voice shaking. "But not what I wanted." He held her gaze. "Then why stay?" The words hung between them like breath in cold air. Claire searched his face. "Because for the first time in my life, I don't feel like I have to shrink to survive. Because I can breathe here. Because the silence used to comfort me. And now, it's killing me." Matthew looked away, jaw clenched. "I didn't ask you to stay." "No," she whispered, eyes welling. "But you started making space for me, and I started to believe it meant something." He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling hard. "I don't know how to be this, Claire. I don't know how to trust that what's in front of me won't disappear." Her voice softened. "Then say that, say anything, but don't punish me for shadows that don't belong to me." The shed was still. Only the soft sound of wind through the slats filled the pause. Matthew took a slow step toward her. "I didn't mean to punish you," Claire nodded, "but silence can be cruel too." He lowered his head, eyes shadowed. "I've only ever known how to endure things, not how to build them." She lifted a hand, not to touch, not yet, but to make him look at her. "You saved my life," she said, "and then you gave me something even harder to find. stillness. But if we keep pretending this marriage is just circumstance, we'll kill whatever good is trying to grow here. He didn't answer, didn't promise, didn't reach for her, but his breathing shifted, like something inside him had finally cracked open. And Claire, heart pounding, took one quiet step back. "Don't let their rumors shape our truth," she said. She turned and left the shed, her boots sinking into the wet earth. Back inside the cabin, the fire had died down to embers. She sat alone, the warmth barely reaching her. On the windowsill rested the second carving he had made, the one where the figures touched. She stared at it, and for the first time she wondered, would he finish it, or let it remain incomplete? The rain came without warning. Not a soft drizzle, but a relentless downpour that swept over Holleridge like an unexpected apology from the sky. The ground, still tender from snowmelt, gave way easily. Mud swallowed footprints. The roof of the cabin groaned beneath the weight of the storm. Claire had just finished stacking herbs near the pantry when the first leak appeared. A single drop on the wooden table, then another, then 5. Within moments, a thin stream of water slid from the corner of the ceiling, following the beam down like a cold thread. Matthew was already pulling on his coat when she called his name. "The roof," she said. "I know." No hesitation, no debate, just movement. They both stepped out into the storm, boots sinking into the earth, shoulders hunched against the cold. Matthew carried a tool bag over one shoulder. Claire held a tarp in her arms and followed him silently around the cabin. Water poured in steady lines from the eaves. The sky above was an endless curtain of grey. The wind slapped against them like a living thing. "We need to cover that corner first," Matthew shouted over the rain, pointing to a section above the chimney. Claire nodded. Without asking, she climbed the ladder after him. The roof was slick, the tiles untrustworthy. Claire's hands gripped the wooden slats like lifelines. Matthew steadied her with one firm hand on her arm before reaching to secure the tarp. Together they moved with the silent rhythm of people who no longer needed instructions to understand one another. At one point she slipped, just slightly, and her palm scraped against a rusted nail. She hissed, pulling back, blood rising in a thin red line. Matthew noticed immediately. "You're hurt." "It's nothing," she said, but he was already reaching for her hand. Still on the roof, still in the rain, he pulled a cloth from his pocket and pressed it gently to her palm, shielding it with his own fingers. The moment stretched between them, water dripping from their clothes, wind curling around their ears, the sky watching in silence. They finished the work in near darkness, the storm tapering just enough for them to finish tying down the last corner. By the time they climbed down, they were soaked, shivering, but the leaks had stopped. Inside, Matthew built the fire higher, and Claire peeled off her coat, her hands still trembling slightly. "Sit," he said, quieter now. She obeyed. He knelt in front of her again, a scene not unlike the one days before, but this time her scraped palm rested in his lap without resistance. He cleaned the wound carefully, wrapping it with fresh cloth. His fingers moved slowly, deliberately. "You didn't have to come up there," he murmured. "I know," she said softly. "But you didn't have to do any of this either." He paused, looked up, their eyes locked. Neither of them smiled, but something else passed between them, steady, grounded, like roots finding soil again. That night, they ate in silence, but it was a silence reborn, less wounded, more shared. Claire reached for the bread before he offered it. He poured her tea before she asked. A kind of choreography had begun between them, wordless but precise. After dinner, she found him near the hearth sanding a new block of wood. She didn't speak. She simply sat nearby, sewing a patch into one of the quilts. The hours passed without drama, without confession, just two people occupying space together. Not as strangers, not quite as lovers, but something in between. Later, as she rinsed her hands at the basin, Claire noticed her bandaged palm trembling, not from pain, but from the echo of his touch. Not possessive, not tender, just present. The storm raged outside, but the cabin, for the first time in days, felt still. Before bed, she paused at the windowsill where the carving rested. It hadn't changed, The hands still touched, but tonight it looked different. Not because the figures had moved, but because she had. She turned off the lamp, the flame dimming to a soft glow, and for a moment she wondered, was this what rebuilding looked like? Two quiet souls repairing a roof in the rain, and something unspoken between them, holding just as steady. The village hadn't changed. Not really. The same crooked signs swayed above doorways, the same stone paths cut through Holleridge like scars, and the same glances followed Claire as she walked alone through the market square. But Claire had changed. She walked differently now, not faster, not louder, but firmer. Her shoulders didn't fold inward anymore. Her chin didn't tilt down to avoid gazes. She didn't scan the road for judgment. If they were watching, let them. If they whispered, let them use her name. It no longer held shame, only truth. Her father was sick. That was why she had returned. She carried a jar of salve and dried elderflower tea in a basket tucked against her arm. His condition wasn't critical, but the fever had left him too weak to rise from bed. She hadn't seen him since the day he forced her into marriage. But when the message arrived from a neighbor asking for help, she had felt only stillness in her chest. Duty no longer ruled her, but compassion still lived there. She knocked once before entering. The house smelled the same, sawdust, leather, and something faintly bitter. Her mother nodded from the chair beside the bed, eyes tired. Frank Montgomery lay beneath blankets, thinner now, the weight of his convictions lost in sweat and silence. Claire set the basket down and pressed a damp cloth to his forehead. He opened his eyes, blinking slowly. "You came," he rasped. "I'm not here to argue," she said. "Just to help." He didn't fight her. For once, he didn't say a word. She stayed only as long as needed, then stepped back into the world that had once devoured her. But this time, she didn't walk fast. She let herself move through the heart of Holleridge, and that's when she saw him. Julian stood near the bakery, perfectly groomed, laughing at something the baker's daughter said. He looked out of place here, even more than he had years ago. Too polished, too rehearsed. When he noticed Claire, the smile faltered, and he stepped forward. "Claire?" She stopped, but didn't approach. "Your father's sick," he said, as if trying to find the right tone. "I heard. I know, I was just there." Julian's eyes searched her face. "You look different." "So they keep telling me." He hesitated. "I meant what I said before, about making things right." She tilted her head. "What would that look like for you? Undoing what's already been lived?" "No," he said carefully, "but building something better, with someone who truly values you." She almost laughed. Not out of cruelty, but realization. "You had that chance, Julian. You threw it away." "I made a mistake," Claire nodded. "And I learned from it." A few villagers had paused nearby, pretending to browse vegetables. She felt their eyes, their breathless curiosity, but this time it didn't shake her. Julian reached into his coat and pulled out a letter. "Just read it. 1 page. That's all I ask." She didn't take it. Behind her, the bell above the general store jingled. Claire turned and saw Margaret Remington stepping out, wrapped in her usual mink and self-righteousness. Her eyes narrowed at the scene before her. "Half course," Margaret said. "A public spectacle again." Claire straightened. "Not a spectacle, a conversation. With the man you once promised to marry, while another wears your ring." Claire didn't respond immediately. She looked at Julian, then at the villagers now gathering without subtlety. Then she stepped forward. "My marriage to Matthew wasn't born from romance," she said, voice clear. "But it's become something more honest than anything I ever had with Julian." Gasps rippled. Margaret's face tightened. Claire continued. "Some of you love to pretend morality is a garment you can wrap around anyone who obeys. But I've learned something different. Honor isn't what people say about you. It's what you can live with at night when the house is quiet and the fire's low." Margaret stepped closer. "And what do you live with, Claire?" "Regret." "No," Claire said softly. "Peace." Julian lowered the letter. Claire looked around the street, at the faces that once defined her, imprisoned her. "I came back to help someone who never helped me," she said. "Not out of guilt, but because I've stopped measuring myself by what you all think." She turned to Margaret again. "You don't have to approve of my life, but you won't rewrite it either." Margaret's lips parted, but no words came. Claire nodded once. "Good day," and she walked away. Not with dramatic flair, not with applause, just calm. As she passed the blacksmith shop, a woman brushed past her and whispered, "Thank you." Claire turned, surprised. The woman didn't stop walking, just kept going, head high, eyes forward, and then another. A young girl near the weaver's stand looked up from her apron and gave Claire a small, almost hidden smile. Something had changed, not in the town, but in the way she stood inside it. When she returned to the cabin, the sun was sinking behind the ridge. The light fell in long stripes across the floorboards, golden and soft. She set her basket down and exhaled slowly, letting the weight of the day fall from her shoulders. Matthew was in the back room. He stepped out quietly, noticing the tension in her posture. "You're back?" She looked at him, truly looked, and said, "Yes." His brows knit faintly, unsure. Claire walked to the table and pulled out a small folded paper. A note, handwritten, not Julian's. She placed it down gently. "What's that?" Matthew asked. "A letter," she said. "Not from someone who failed me, from someone I may have unknowingly helped." He tilted his head. Claire smiled, soft, quiet. "She said I gave her courage." Matthew said nothing, but his shoulders relaxed. The carving on the shelf hadn't changed, but Claire had. And when her fingers brushed its edge that evening, she found herself tracing not the figures, but the space between them. Still there, still waiting, but no longer cold. The morning after her return from the village, Claire found a letter slipped beneath the cabin door. It wasn't sealed with wax. The paper was folded simply, corners soft, the handwriting uneven, but careful. At first, she thought it might be from Julian, or perhaps from her father's neighbor, but when she opened it, the words reached straight into her chest, quiet, trembling, and unfamiliar. "I don't know if you'll read this, or if it will matter, but I saw you yesterday. I saw you speak, not with anger, but with a kind of strength I've never seen in someone like us. You didn't try to please them, and somehow you didn't apologize for it. I want to learn how to be like that. Thank you." A girl who's been watching Claire read the letter 3 times. Each time her hands trembled a little more. The ink bled slightly on the page where the writer had pressed too hard, like the words had fought to come out. There was no name, no return address. Just the echo of something Claire hadn't expected to ever become. An example. She folded the paper slowly, reverently, then placed it on the table as if it were made of something sacred. The day passed gently after that. The wind softened. The sun returned briefly, casting golden lines through the windows. Claire worked in the kitchen garden, turning the earth with careful movements, her thoughts turning with it. Matthew returned from checking traps in the woods. His presence no longer startled her. It filled the air like pine smoke, steady, natural grounding. She stood when she saw him coming. He paused at the edge of the garden, his coat still dusted with frost, an axe slung across one shoulder. Their eyes met. No tension, no questions, just presence. "Someone wrote to me," she said. He stepped closer. "Julian?" She shook her head. "No, a girl from the village. I don't know who. She said I made her feel like she could be braver." Matthew studied her face. "That surprises you?" Claire looked away, brushing soil from her hands. "I never thought anyone saw me like that." He stepped beside her, not too close, just enough to share the weight of the moment. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "people see us better when we stop trying to be seen." She turned to him. "Do you see me?" He didn't flinch. "I do," he said, "more every day." It wasn't a line. It wasn't even romantic. It was true. And the truth of it cracked something open inside her. She didn't think, didn't weigh the moment. She stepped toward him, gently, like testing a fragile bridge, and wrapped her arms around his waist. No pretext, no justification, just the simplest version of yes. Matthew didn't hesitate. His arms folded around her, strong and certain. This time there was no danger, no wolves, no storm outside. Just 2 people choosing to be still in the same place at the same time. He rested his chin lightly against her hair. His breath was steady. His hands didn't grip. They held. Not like a possession, but like a promise still forming. They stayed like that longer than either expected. When she finally pulled back, Claire looked up. His eyes were softer now. The corners of his mouth relaxed in a way she hadn't seen before. "You carved the figures," she said. "Did you ever finish them?" "Not yet." "Why not?" His gaze didn't waver. "I didn't know how to show what they were feeling." Claire nodded slowly. "I think now maybe you do." He didn't respond. But later that night, as the fire warmed the room and the shadows grew longer, she noticed him at the table, carving knife in hand. The block of wood was already shaped, but now his movements were more careful, more certain. She didn't interrupt. She sat near the fire, letter in her lap, letting it warm like a secret only she knew how to hold. The cabin no longer felt like something she'd been placed into. It felt like something she had helped build, moment by moment, silence by silence, breath by breath. Later, when they sat across from each other for supper, they didn't speak much, but Claire reached for the bread before he offered it, and Matthew, without looking, poured her tea the moment her cup was nearly empty. Small things, but not small at all. And as the wind curled once more around the cabin like a memory trying to return, Claire held the anonymous letter close to her chest and wondered how many other girls were watching. How many had felt invisible? Until now. Time passed in its quiet, deliberate way. The snow returned once more, but this time it didn't bring fear. It came like a memory, softer, less intrusive. The cabin, which had once held silence like a cage, now carried it like a song, a rhythm of breathing, of daily gestures, of hands brushing in passing, of voices low but present. Claire woke before the sun most mornings. Her feet hit the wooden floor with quiet certainty. She no longer questioned whether she belonged. She simply did. She moved through the rooms as if they had always known her shape. The space bent around her, not out of obligation, but welcome. Matthew built new shelves that spring, not because they needed them, but because he wanted to see her books lined up properly. He carved wooden hooks by the door for her scarves, a stool for her garden boots, a bench for mornings by the fire. They never spoke of these things, they just became part of the house. And then, one quiet afternoon, Claire told him she was with child. He didn't speak at first. He only stepped forward and placed a hand on her waist, then rested his forehead gently against hers. She closed her eyes, and when he whispered, "You're not alone," the words didn't echo in the cabin, they landed. That summer, Matthew planted a garden behind the cabin, rows of herbs, tomatoes, beets, carrots. Claire worked beside him, hands in the dirt, belly slowly rising with new life. She laughed more, not loudly but often. She told stories while they weeded, sometimes about her childhood, sometimes about nothing at all. He listened. Always. The baby was born in the fall, a boy with eyes as dark as Matthew's, and a cry that pierced the dawn. They named him Elias. Claire held him with the tenderness of someone who had once been held in silence, and now knew the power of presence. Matthew cried that night, just a little, just once, and never said a word about it. The seasons turned. The second child came 2 years later, a girl with fierce lungs and Claire's softness. They named her June. After the first month, Claire remembered smiling without caution. The garden grew, the shelves filled, and the townspeople, little by little, changed their tone. At first, they came with hesitation. A neighbor asking for help, mending a torn shawl. A man requesting advice on herbs for sleep. Then came bread shared in baskets, invitations to village gatherings. Claire declined the first few. Then one day she didn't. She went. Matthew stayed home with the children. When she returned, her cheeks were red from the cold and from something else. Warmth, familiarity. A sense that she was no longer someone they merely tolerated, but someone they could learn from. One afternoon, Margaret Remington herself arrived at the garden fence. She didn't enter, just stood there, gloved hands folded, eyes scanning the rows of lettuce and thyme. Claire looked up from where she knelt, June babbling beside her. "Mrs. Remington," she greeted calmly. Margaret didn't answer at first. Then, finally, "The time's coming in strong this year," Claire nodded. "It responds to patience." A pause. Then Margaret asked quietly, "And what of forgiveness?" Claire looked at her for a long time, and then said, "It responds to honesty." Margaret said nothing more. She left. But she never spoke ill of Claire again. Inside the cabin, the changes were quiet but deep. Matthew still carved. Only now the figures had multiplied. One on a bench, arms around a child. Another planting seeds. A third, two adults standing side by side. Hands not just touching, but interlaced. Claire found them tucked in corners, on shelves, on the mantel. A silent love letter in wood. She never asked when he made them. She only dusted them gently, as one would a memory worth keeping. On warm nights, they sat on the porch, their children playing near the edge of the trees. Claire would lean her head on Matthew's shoulder. He'd rest his hand over hers. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they didn't, but they always stayed. One evening, Elias fell and scraped his knee on a rock. Claire rushed to him, but Matthew got there first. He knelt, checked the wound, then lifted the boy into his arms. "It's all right," he murmured, brushing dirt from the boy's cheek. "I've got you." Claire watched from a few steps away, her chest full, not just with love, but with the realization that somewhere between winter and now, Matthew had become more than a husband, more than a provider. He had become someone safe, not just for her, for all of them. And in the quiet that followed, Claire returned to her seat, eyes glistening, because she knew the life they had was not loud, not extraordinary, but it was real. It was steady, and it had been built not on the ruins of what was forced, but on the choices they had made. One breath, one kindness, one carved figure at a time. And yet, as the evening sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in pink and fire, she felt something stir inside. Not doubt, not worry, just a question, one that had waited long enough to be asked. And tomorrow, she would ask it. The first snow returned in late November, not as a storm this time, but as a whisper, delicate flakes floating down like quiet blessings. The forest, still heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth, received it with reverence, and the cabin, no longer a prison, but a home, embraced it as if it had always been waiting. Claire stood by the window, June asleep in her arms. Her daughter's breathing was soft against her collarbone. Outside, Elias ran in circles, chasing flakes, laughing as they landed on his nose. Matthew watched from the porch, arms crossed loosely, content. It was the kind of stillness Claire had once feared. Now it filled her. She kissed her daughter's hair, placed her gently in the cradle, and stepped outside. The air was cold, but not cruel. She walked barefoot across the wooden planks of the porch until she stood beside Matthew. He didn't turn right away. He didn't have to. "I've been thinking," she said, voice quiet. He looked at her now. "About what?" She glanced at the snow-covered trees, then at the cabin behind them. "About roots." Matthew waited. "I used to think survival was about escape," she continued, "getting away from everything that hurt. But it wasn't. It was about staying long enough to grow past the pain." He nodded, his eyes holding hers. She stepped closer. "We never chose this in the beginning. No. But every day since, we did." He reached for her hand. Then, slowly, gently, their fingers interlaced. And she realized it wasn't the first time they'd stood like this, but it was the first time she saw it for what it was. Not silence, not resignation. Love, the kind that doesn't rush, that doesn't demand grand gestures. That grows where no one thought it could. She leaned her head on his shoulder. They stood like that for a long time, watching the snow blanket the earth that had once threatened to swallow them whole. It didn't feel threatening anymore. It felt like memory, like a circle closing. Later that evening, they sat on the porch steps while Elias slept and June cooed in her cradle. Matthew reached beside him and lifted a small carved figure, unfinished but familiar. "It's them again," Claire smiled, recognizing the shape of two figures seated beside each other. He nodded, I've carved them 100 times, but this is the first one I'm finishing." She tilted her head. "Why now?" His voice was low. "Because I finally understand what they're looking at." Claire didn't ask, he didn't explain, but somehow she knew. It wasn't a future, it wasn't a past, it was now. The life they'd chosen, the quiet they'd filled, the love that had waited beneath everything else, patient and steady until it could breathe. And then came the sentence she hadn't expected, from him, barely a whisper. "I would choose it again, even if I knew how hard it would be." Claire didn't answer with words. She simply took his hand in both of hers and pressed it to her chest, over the place that had once been all fear, now all warmth. They sat like that until the light faded, until the stars replaced the snow, until the silence between them became something sacred, not the kind that hides, but the kind that reveals. Because in the end, love didn't come with fireworks or vows. It came with roots and snow and stillness, and the slow, quiet certainty that even what begins in winter can bloom. They didn't exchange grand vows. They didn't need applause or witnesses. They simply stayed, when leaving would have been easier. Because sometimes, love doesn't come with promises. It comes with silence, with care, with choices made every single day. And when the snow falls again, they no longer hide. They bloom even in the cold. If this story touched you, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments, where are you listening from? Your support is what keeps these stories alive.